Welcome to another episode of Ask a Pianist. My name is Andrew Aarons, and today we'll be considering a rather common problem that exists in modern pianism. Though it is possible to dedicate oneself professionally to performing music that is either obscure or unknown, the majority of the repertoire in the canon that we must learn is quite well known, almost to the point where an audience will know every note you're about to play before you've played it. This brings up an inevitable question which students have asked me before. How can I make a piece that is very famous my own? This is a difficult question to answer, and like many difficult questions, I'm going to tackle it here. Today, we'll consider perhaps the most famous Chopin etude, that of Opus 10, number 3. This piece is not only memorable from a pianist's point of view, the melody has been co-opted in the pop music scene as well, so really it comes to audiences from two radically different sources. Here's the main melody, which I'm sure you are familiar with. Now, the first step to learning a famous piece is actually one of resetting our expectations and ignoring our past listening experience. We have to approach the piece as if we've never heard it before. This means careful study of the score, as well as double-checking things that we'd normally take for granted, like rhythmic gestures and note values in the melody. Once this is taken care of, we can end up with an interpretation that is rather neutral, but not ignorant of the style of the composer. It's at this point where making a piece your own becomes a subject which requires a lot of honest thinking. What makes a performance unique? Or more to the point, what makes a musical interpretation unique compared with other interpretations that we've heard before? It all comes down to what we choose to communicate to the listener using the music as a medium. Though that's a rather obvious statement, I think it's important to think about because of the fact that we're choosing what to say. This implies that we've thought about alternate ideas or paths, and we've consciously decided what path to follow. This choice starts out perhaps on the most general level, what we think the composer is trying to say, what we would individually like to say, and of course, what kind of balance we want to strike between our impression of the composer and our selfish wishes. Within all of this are distinct choices which are made on specific levels of interpretation. Tempo, rubato, ornamentation, and all of that. When it's all put together, the hope is that one has constructed an interpretation that is cohesive, where the elements seem to all add up in a thoughtful, seemingly inevitable way. When these elements are not cohesive, that's when the problems really arise, and when interpretation seems to be random or haphazard. So, let's consider what we can do with this etude. The first time I played the whole first section, I did so in a manner which I thought was rather neutral and not offensive. The elements of the score were all present, but I didn't really lean towards one specific interpretation. It was a generally okay performance. Now, we have to make some distinct choices in order to decide what kind of direction we want this interpretation to take. In terms of broad, general interpretation, pianism really exists between two limits: exaggeration and non-exaggeration. Within these limits, we play. As an example, the ritardando that leads to the fortissimo in bar 17 is an important structural moment in the main theme. Now, how much of a ritardando do we make? How much is too little? How much is too much? And how much feels just right? I could play this using a small ritardando just near the end, like this. I could also stretch the ritardando almost to a failing point, like this. I could try to play something in between that feels right to me, like this. But all of these are acceptable, even ideal options. There's nothing definitely wrong with any of them when they're taken out of the total musical context. In other words, as moments of music, anything is possible. This is a very important point to realize. When we think about musical interpretation and cohesiveness, what we're really looking at is how well musical moments like the one we just played work in the total structure, or in the total effect on an audience. There's a built-in assumption when playing pieces by great composers that the composers have already worked out what is best structurally for the pieces. Therefore, you can trust the order of events that happen. If Chopin writes a climax here, you can trust that it's not coming too early in the piece or too late, as an example. And therefore, the adjustment of what you do with that climax is dependent not on you trying to integrate the climax into the rest of the piece, but actually just about you learning from the piece what to do with the climax. The piece, due to its construction, can inform you what kind of climax you will want to make, which actually makes things quite easy. The hard part is determining what you think the piece says, and subsequently how you will make that happen. Remember how I mentioned that we must first determine the general level of interpretation before dealing with the nitty-gritty of it all? Well, our ritardando fits quite well into this problem. We can't know how much of a ritardando to make unless we know where it fits in the structure of the piece. And we can't know how we want to communicate the structure of the piece until we know what our interpretation in a broad sense is aiming towards. Let's consider what happens when we perform this opening section with lots of temporal freedom, lots of rubato, and copious amounts of what I would call momentism. Listen specifically to how the ritardando at the climax is affected by all the previous material and how this material was played. We can call this an emotional interpretation. With this kind of case, the ritardando has no effectiveness unless it is exaggerated beyond what came before. We are forced to make a large ritardando because the overall interpretation of the piece requires it. To not make a large ritardando would be to remove this moment from the musical aesthetic that we've previously built. This would create an example of a fractured or haphazard interpretation. I'll play it again so you can see what I mean. We'll have the emotional interpretation, but with a ritardando that simply doesn't fit. This problem of integration of musical elements is one that not only applies to temporal distortions like rubato, but also to elements such as tone production, rhythmic strictness or flexibility, and even elements such as dynamics or articulation. This is why it can be problematic when we are playing famous pieces. In our attempt to make a famous piece sound new or different to an audience, we may consider changing small nuances for the sake of sounding different, without specifically integrating those nuances into the piece in terms of general interpretation. I could play a very emotional interpretation of this piece with a short ritardando that goes against expectations, for the sole purpose of saying that I'm doing something different. But this is, in terms of interpretation, very weak, and comes off sounding like a special effect, which has no meaning beyond the effect itself. This becomes even more problematic if we consider that many composers, including Chopin, struggled with concepts of efficiency in their music. There's nothing there that is redundant. Having an effect that is not integrated, at least in Chopin, is having something that is not efficient to the transmission of the music. A worst-case scenario can exist when we ignore this kind of integration entirely and simply reduce the piece to lovely-sounding moments. I'll give you an example of this. The main theme could be seen as one long theme like this. I could, however, break it up into several small components, each with their own set of interpretational rules. Our first section is here. And maybe I'll take some time with it, like this. Our second section drops off a bit. So perhaps let's exaggerate a lot, like this. Then we have the third section that has a huge leap to the C sharp. We can't ignore this, can we? After all, we need to make our audience swoon a bit, so this will be huge. And the end seems rather boring, so we'll just gloss over it. Now in bits, this isn't too much of a problem, but when we put it all together, it sounds like this. I have to be clear about this. This kind of playing is not horrible because of the technique of playing or how the notes sound. It's horrible because the built-in cohesiveness in the score is ignored and consciously ruptured by the performer in favor of their own wishes. So, we end up back where we started. How can we make a famous piece our own? Well, it's difficult in the world we live in today, because for many of these works, there have been so many different performances and recordings, all approaching the piece from a basis of integration to varying degrees, that unless we do something that completely changes the score, we're always going to sound derivative. This is a legitimate danger, but that being said, there is a way out without going the route of full obliteration. This actually brings us back to the problem of having a general interpretation concept of a piece in which the elements that create the interpretation are all cohesive. If you do this, then the moments within the interpretation have much more impact on the audience, and in turn are actually much more memorable. I'll give you my current interpretation of this piece. It falls somewhere between a very emotional performance and a very conservative or held-back performance. The intention is to give the impression that the music is conveying a sense of remembrance or reminiscence, rather than immediate, powerful emotions. Now, I know that this interpretation style has similarities to others, some on famous recordings, but the point is that the interpretation remains mine because I've not only decided on the interpretation of the work as a whole, but I've consciously weighed and selected each sector of interpretational language to create my final product. For instance, I will use a very thick and lustrous sound in the beginning melody, like this. But this sound quality will not stay this way forever. I actually make the sound quality very transparent when we get louder, like at the ritardando here. But this is a conscious choice for the sound aesthetic I wish to create. Similarly, trying to convey a kind of reminiscence to the melody requires me to not be too exaggerated in terms of using rubato. If I were to use more rubato in the main theme, I'd give the impression of a more immediate romantic aspect to the music, like this. But I've decided not to. Finally, and most importantly, each decision that was made on the small scale is cohesive with the structure of the piece, which, coincidentally, is not flexible. Every decision I make can be summarily overturned or dismissed if it proves to compromise the structural flow of the piece. So what you have in the end is an interpretation that is completely yours. We are all unique people with unique experiences, desires, and preferences. If you want to create an interpretation of a piece that is solely yours, all you have to do is learn the piece as if it wasn't famous. You'd still have to do all this work regardless, but at least you wouldn't have the added fear or distraction of someone saying, "Oh, such and such a pianist did that years ago," or "You're just copying this pianist or recording." Copying a performance style is not necessarily a problem, but it is if you're trying to integrate individual nuances into your own performance without knowing why the pianist you're copying did them in the first place. I can copy what other pianists have done for the ritardando, but ultimately it won't fit because I don't know why they decided to play it that way in the first place. Why does a particular pianist play the rit very slow or not too slow? I don't know. But if I put it into my interpretation not because it is cohesive, but because a famous pianist played it that way, I'm going towards the worst case interpretation scenario, that of a fractured interpretation, which doesn't make sense. So, that's it for this episode of Ask a Pianist. Until next time, keep practicing, and don't worry about making a piece your own. If you've done your homework, it'll be yours no matter what anyone says. Bye for now.